Hi, my name is Austin Gerughty, and I'm here with Gina Harrison. We are both fourth grade teachers in Fayette County, and I am currently in EDU 583, which is a linguistics course. I'm on my track to get my ESL endorsement, and I'm here to teach Gina some of the things I've been learning in my class. And I would love for Gina to tell a little bit about herself because she also has some interesting backgrounds with linguistics and different languages.
All right, thanks, Austin. So most of my experience has come from true experiences, not formal education. So it's been great having ongoing conversations with Austin and learning more about the linguistics class and how I can better serve kids that are in my classroom right now. But I think that the majority of my experience came when I was a teacher at Maxwell Elementary, which is an immersion program. At Maxwell, half of the day is taught to English-speaking students, but in a target language of Spanish. So I was a kindergarten teacher. I taught reading to children at...
You're fine.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
So I taught reading to students in English, but then I had a Spanish partner. Actually, she was from Mexico, and we had teachers from Colombia and Spain and Puerto Rico and all across the world, really, from Spanish-speaking countries. And they would switch over to my Spanish partner and then learn Spanish, math, and science through Spanish. And with them just beginning the talk in Spanish. It wasn't always 100% Spanish, but the goal was 100% Spanish, so that they would just pick it up. My children also went to that program, so I've been able to see it as an educator in action and what it also is like to have a child in a classroom where what's being taught isn't in their first language. Yeah. And that can be such a challenge. So even though we signed up for it and it was our choice, I do know some of the difficulties that kids can face and the help that I could offer as a parent.
Yeah, that's such an awesome experience that I feel like almost every teacher should have to go through because, our school is a third ESL and we don't really accommodate the way we should, and it sounds like that school, is full on into that immersion process.
It is, and but not targeting ESL learners necessarily. We do have we did have some kids who were Spanish speakers who were in the program, but primarily, targeting a second language there for English speakers.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
so
that's cool.
You're getting the informal way, and I'm kind of learning the formal, and that's why I love that we can kind of bounce off each other. So the study of linguistics is what we've been learning about, and that's the study of many different fields. Like people kind of associate linguistics with, I'm going to learn about grammar and grammar rules, where it goes much further beyond that and kind of just to the study of language and the structure of language. So we did learn about grammar, and this was something very interesting to me because in my schooling I was taught, here's a noun, you need to put quotation marks here, like very formal grammar rules, and that's kind of traditional grammar and kind of having a prescriptive view of grammar, where you're going to follow those rules and this is how you're supposed to use it. Whereas we started to learn about descriptive grammar and functional grammar, so how does the language function and how do those rules function like in society? So that was really interesting to learn about. Do you have any thoughts on how grammar should be taught?
Well, in language acquisition, in my experience, what happened is just like babies acquire language, it's just from hearing it. They hear it first and can understand more than they can actually output. But they just have to experience it again and again. And that was sort of the model that my kids went through. So they heard lots of Spanish, and they couldn't necessarily use all those Spanish words or use them all correctly in like proper verb form or in the correct tense or conjugate it. But the goal was that you can communicate with me in the target language. And so along the way, and as my time there, I also decided that I would try to be a student and just learn from all of the folks around me who had these skills that I did, and I haven't ever had any Spanish courses. So we just tried to dive in and use what we could, even though I probably sounded like, a 5-year-old trying to speak. But luckily I was around people who supported me. And now as my kids went through, they're continuing their program on into middle and high school.
Yeah.
And now it's becoming more formal. Just like in their English courses, now, there's a little bit more attention being paid to the complexity of their sentences and how they're punctuating it and using all of the formal rules. The same is holding true later now with Spanish and a couple years past where they were doing with English. Now that they have the language under their belt and they can manipulate it in some ways, now they can start to apply more of those formal rules.
Because we definitely learned about some of those misconceptions that people have, where even with as infants, people think the way a child learns language is through reinforcement. So, oh, you said that correctly, or I need to correct you. Whereas there's no way a child is learning language that way, is what we kind of learned, was because they're not speaking like adults. They start with kind of broken English and then maybe a sentence, and so they're building on it. And that's kind of where we need to have that view, is our kids who are coming in from Mexico or Africa, like, they're not going to be able to just learn English right away. It's going to have to be kind of this natural process.
I agree 100%.
And we also kind of talked about was a lot of teachers, I think, have this view, for you to be successful in my class, you need to know English. And that's going to be it. Like, you need to speak English at home. I'm sure parents are sitting in conferences and that's what they're told. Like, oh, what can I do to help my child? And their teacher's probably saying, you need to speak English at home. Well, no, you don't. You don't at all.
Right.
So the kids are going to learn it, but kind of through this, we talked about systematic functional linguistics, and that's talking about how a child's going to use it with its function. So it's going to learn the different grammar rules and stuff as they're using it in a meaningful way. So that was another big thing we talked about, was creating meaningful experiences, which I think is a big thing in elementary school in general. But we really want them to learn it in a way that they're going to be able to use it. And a lot of that is what you've said, communication. That's a huge reason why we, write and we speak, is to communicate with people. So helping them learn it in that way is going to help them, in the long run, really understand and learn the languages.
I like the idea of getting a lot of practice in social situations. Because just like with English, the way that, I'll speak to you at work versus the way I might speak to you if we were, if I just saw you hanging around, would be different. There would be a different level of formality called for each situation. And to give kids those different opportunities in authentic practice, I think is really meaningful to them, and they can pick it up. Maybe they can't even describe it. They might not be able to say, this is what I did, so now I know at lunch I can use this way, but whenever I'm writing I need to use this manner of speaking. They will begin to generalize those skills, I think.
And we've kind of talked about that. I know me personally, I don't always write the way I talk. I think I'm much more informal when I speak. Like, I'll say awesome and cool, whereas if I'm writing a paper, I'm not going to use terminology like that. And I think it's kind of interesting, especially nowadays with texting. The way people text is so different than the way they talk. I know that's how I am. I would never put laugh out loud in a paper. You convey it in such a different way that I think it only has to come to these kids naturally, because they're having to learn, like, the way I talk to my teacher and my parents is different than I'm talking out at recess with my friends. And it could be confusing to them because they're going to have to learn it naturally in those social situations, like we've been focused on so much. Another thing we've been talking about a lot is creating this inclusive environment, and one way we can do that is through the WIDA can-do philosophy. And I made you this copy, and I'll have a copy posted to the bottom of this video. But this philosophy is just helping us understand that all these kids are valuable. And I know sometimes when a child gets to school, like, they might be viewed as kind of more of an issue than they should be.
Yeah.
And I know we've kind of talked about with some of our children. I know you had a student that, unfortunately, he left to a different school, and you really wanted to fight for him to be here, but we kind of got the vibe like others thought it was more difficult to have them around. And so how do you feel about that?
Well, that was heartbreaking, and so I'll try not to break into tears here because this particular situation was very difficult for me. I kind of started investing in this kid last year when he moved here, and their whole family, I was aware of the needs of the whole family, and I'll tell a quick little story. Culturally, there are some differences in what you might be acceptable in, like, cleanliness and hygiene and just what's okay. But I felt like he was kind of in tune to that because his manner of dress, he had a style.
Yeah.
And it was kind of formal. It looked really intentional. And so there was, he had worn one particular outfit all week, but you could tell it was maybe like his best outfit.
Yeah.
But by the end of the week, I mean, he's a growing boy.
Yes.
Hormones are coming into play. And really, the clothes, they needed to be washed.
Yes.
No one here really had the complete language ability to communicate with him in a kind way.
Yes.
To say, I want to help you. This is important, you know, this is important. And unfortunately, what happened, the teacher requested that he got changed, and someone with a very kind heart did change him, got him extra clothes, gave him some choice, but he was heartbroken and embarrassed, and maybe even afraid that his good clothes weren't going to be returned to him. And he had a lot of difficulty returning to class because the clothes that they put him in were very, very American, really. They were loose sports clothes. And he was just mortified.
Yeah.
I feel like he didn't have the language to be able to say that
properly. Yeah.
and we didn't have the language to be able to reassure him.
Yes.
So that was kind of my first experience in with him, and throughout the year I got to know him a bit more. This year, ironically, when I taught fourth grade, I knew he was going to wind up in my class, and he did, and I was a little bit intimidated but also very excited. Through my life, I know some other Africans, and I've experienced soccer boys
Yes.
who are from Africa, and they're very open with me and talk. But I was excited to have this kid, and I made him feel safe.
Yes.
He knew I loved him, or that I
Yes.
was crazy about him. He was working hard. He called out, and even when he called out, any time he was calling out in English, I just loved it. It was fine. He was on task and trying to learn. And then I would also ask him, give a mutual respect back to him. Hey, can you help me? How would you say this in Swahili? How do you say good morning? Jambo. How do you say goodbye? How do you say my sister? And that became such a sense of pride for him. It elevated him.
Yes.
And so now, instead of kind of hiding his difference, now we could celebrate it.
Because I know we talked about, similar with my student Zora, we've talked about how, you know, me and you have on our door, it says Jambo, just as another phrase to kind of welcome the students.
Yeah.
And then Zora is very similar with him, and I know we kind of shared a lot of those same experiences. And then the one thing we've kind of noticed this year was we don't really provide them with the resources they need, even to go home and give their parents a piece of paper. And that's something I think we need to work on, which I know we are, because there was one day where every time I'd give Zora paper, it would be in English.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, they didn't give me in Swahili. And of course, you know, I didn't have the resources to go and get that paper, but we started talking to people, and then there was one day she finally got it in Swahili, and her face just lit up because we were advocating for that. I know you were too. We're advocating for that inclusion and making sure we know, like, it's not just English and Spanish here. There's also many other languages where I think that sometimes the view is, you know, your ESL students they're only going to speak Spanish, whereas there's so many different languages that currently we just have Swahili and Spanish, but you never know what we're going to get.
Absolutely.
And we have to be prepared to make it a safe place where I know you did, and we've had many conversations on how to do that. And I think that's great, but I think everyone needs to understand that kids are going to come, even kids who aren't necessarily English language learners, they're going to have different dialects, and the way they speak might be different from the way we speak, but we need to understand that's okay. And we can give them the tools. I watched a really cool video. It was a teacher, and he was teaching his kids how to code switch between standard American English and their dialect. And so the kids, it was like, I ain't got none.
Yeah.
And he was like, how can we change that? And then they were deciding on how could I rephrase that in a way, but he wasn't putting any negativity towards that phrase, I ain't got none. He was just teaching them a tool that they could use to switch back and forth, which was, I think, really cool.
I do too. And, we do want to correct them, but the idea behind that, there are rules for the way they speak there, and it's totally acceptable in some situations. And I would prefer that it not be with me, but to respect that, and then to build that bridge to facilitate it over to how could you say that, like the school way, or more in like standard English. That I think that that's a good point.
So I think it's just building that respect, because I know naturally we kind of want to correct, and I'm sure in the past when I wasn't as open to this, I probably did it a lot more than I thought, whereas now I'm like kind of catching myself, oh, it's okay they say it that way. But just maybe simply repeating it to them in the standard way to where they're kind of hearing it both ways, but again, not, and I know you don't do this, but not being disrespectful to them or making them feel like they're any lesser because that's the way they speak.
Yeah. So,
and that's just kind of getting into that valuing the student and valuing their culture and their dialect, where again, I think a lot of people think ESL students, it's going to be a kid from a different country, and then you're dealing with having to teach them English, whereas there's so much going on within our own culture right now in dialects and the way we speak that we just need to be open to make sure we're including everyone in this idea that linguistics is this natural thing that needs to be valued no matter what direction it's coming from.
Right.
So within what we've been learning, we've also just talked about like, why is English so difficult, which I, as a kid, had difficulty learning English. So it was kind of interesting to learn, well, why did my brain not process it the way, and I've been fluent in English since I can remember, and I was taught all those rules, but some things that were funny that we just don't think about is the way things are spelt. So one word was the word ballet or colonel. Colonel, I didn't even notice. Like I haven't, like until I watched the video, like I didn't notice like that's how it's spelled, but it went back into the history of how it was spelt by a certain language this way, and then we picked up the sound from the other language. So it's kind of interesting when we get into like phonetic sounds that students just, they get confused sometimes. The best example I have recently was I was working with Zora, and we were doing the sight word find, and so her next sight word was the word in, and she was like, wait a second, this says in, this says find, but it has in inside of it. And I was like, that's just stuff, this is my first year working with kids like this, so it's stuff I just didn't even think about, like that they can recognize, and we need to start recognizing to show her, even though the letters look the same, their sounds are different. And then that's where we get into like the phonetic alphabet, and how the symbols for the sounds don't necessarily match the letters, which we also have silent letters inside of words like lamb, and it's just, they're having to learn all these rules that they don't even know about.
And it's torture. English is so difficult even for English speakers, I mean, to your point. And depending on how you were taught to read, whether it was the whole brain approach or a phonetic approach, can really change your experiences with that. Being a kindergarten teacher, I did so much work with letters,
that's something
sounds.
I feel like I definitely need to, on top of that, like maybe go to a training to where, because I have no background in that. I've taught
Mm-hmm.
intermediate, and by the time they get to me, for the most part, they know what they're doing. So my knowledge has to shift. So I know, especially this year, like I have kids who, you know, they really need some help with those sounds, and my not like
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to go get professional development, and I'm making plans to do that just because I need to be prepared to support these kids.
Yeah, and I think really just some small. I mean, I was thinking in regard to the particular student that I lost. Some of the materials that I had from kindergarten really would
Yeah.
help him, and not to be insulting in any way, but there were some word skills
Yes.
that he needs, and to unlock a few of those would really make a difference for him. So that's I've got a bunch of supplies if you
No,
want
I
to
know
borrow
you
any
do.
of
I've
those.
loved
You can.
having that mind to kind of. I know we've started introducing a lot of motions with the way when we're talking
Yeah.
and saying vocabulary. It's just a different mindset that I think people need to, because it's only growing. The population of, you know, English language
Absolutely.
learners is only growing. So I think everyone needs to be prepared. The last thing I kind of wanted to touch on, which kind of goes along with this, is having this different view. So kind of changing our mindset. And this kind of goes back to the systematic functional linguistics that I talked about. And here's an article, and this is posted on my blog, the link below. And this is kind of taking this learning view. So learning view is this view that we're going to teach directly and explicitly these rules and these grammars that you're going to follow, the grammatical rules. Whereas an acquisition view, it goes back to kind of this, whereas we're going to teach it in a meaningful way. So whether it's through writing or spelling, you know, I know one thing we don't do is spelling tests, because we've all had that conversation. Like, it seems like a waste of time, because even though they may not be the best spellers yet, they're going to build on that as they start to see these words through reading and conversations, and they can build their spelling through that, which I'm, you know, a terrible speller, and it's something I willingly tell people. But my problem's not with, like, necessarily spelling out the word, it's the sounds they make. And I still get hung up on, you know, if there's a word that's not spelled by its sounds necessarily, that trips me up really bad. And I'm kind of open with my students to say, that's okay, there's resources where we can help with that, but I can still function. I don't think they view me any lesser because I can't do that, and I want them to feel the same way.
Actually, probably because you are presenting yourself as vulnerable.
Yes.
That opens the door for them to also be that
Yes.
way, and to be all right with we don't know it, but we don't know it yet kind of thing. So I agree with, I used to give spelling tests and I just hated it, because ironically a kid would do very well on the spelling test and then never again in the writing did it ever show up the right way. So, you know, thinking about words and making analogies to other words. Find, if you can spell find, you can spell kind.
Yes.
And then, of course, then you get to the one that doesn't follow the rule. It just makes you crazy trying to help someone out. But as long as they're making progress toward, you know, trying to spell and trying to apply, I think just using those as teaching opportunities and not as a deficit is a great way
And I
to
know
approach
we've talked about, like, you know, you use Spanish words in your classroom, and, you know, I'm starting to, and it's okay if it's a little silly or we say it wrong and the kids are helping us, and we need to help them understand, like, it's okay to laugh at yourself.
Right.
Zora was cracking up yesterday because the word find, every time she sees it, she says found.
Oh.
And we, on the board, we showed find, found, the two different sounds, but she would spell it out correctly, and then we would do the tap, and she would go found, and then she would start laughing, and it's like, I want her to laugh. I want her to think it's okay to make these mistakes, because to me, she has the beginning sound, she has the end sound. It's just these vowels, which we've learned about, are really
Vowels
hard.
are so hard. Yeah.
And knowing the different, you know, short and long vowels are so much different than the consonants. So it's just, I just want them to know it's okay.
Yeah, and you know, I just with what you said there, if a student comes as an English speaker and they miss maybe the first 3 years of elementary, let's say they come in as a third grader, much of the formal phonetic training is over, and they miss that chance. So if we don't have our teachers on their game of being able to supplement them somehow, and you know, we can't stop and we can't get into complete phonics lessons because of the needs of the whole group, but incorporating that in, you know, a bilingual brain, which is what they
Yes.
have. It's what I crave. I mean, I
Yes,
would love to have
I
that.
know, me too.
Because it helps you problem solve so many things. So it upsets me to think that some people look at someone who is acquiring English as maybe not intelligent.
Yes.
Because that's not it.
No, not at all.
It's just that they can't communicate it yet in the language that you're using. Just as if we turned the tables.
Yes, it would be. I think people don't make
What
that
could I
connection.
say? Yeah.
I've found a really fun article, and I'll post this below too. But it was kind of opened my eyes really, because I know your children are bilingual, and my wife speaks Marathi and Hindi, and I want my kids to have that. And it's talking about like, it is such an asset to them, and it's something I can't understand. But like, to really think about my wife and your children can switch back between two different languages at the flip of a coin.
Yes.
That shows there's so much going on in their brain.
Yes.
And they know so much more. And my wife always talks about like, she'll dream in Marathi, and then she'll think in English, and then she'll speak in Marathi, and then it just like, that's something they're accessing in there that I'm not currently doing, but it's so like beautiful
What
to
a
think
gift.
about. Yes.
Yeah, what a gift. And one of the sales pitches for like an immersion education is what it does for your brain, and really how complex your thinking can be based on that, like the benefit of learning music, how it increases the way you think, or the patterns that go on in your brain. Same happens when you're acquiring language. And there's some sacrifice when you pursue a bilingual education, but the benefits, I think, really outweigh it. So I can't wait till you have a baby and let me hear the Hindi speaking child. It will be so wonderful.
Yeah.
It'll be just a beautiful thing you could do for them.
Which a really awesome part of this course was my professor, so Dr. Westerland. She's bilingual, so we've gotten to get that view of another perspective that I can't have, but I want to learn from other people. And I'll post her blog link below because it has some awesome stuff. But it's just kind of giving another perspective and her personal experiences of how she's going to learn and how these kids are going to learn, and using that, drawing on her own experiences, which is something else we need to do with these students, is they need to always draw on their experiences, because it's so beautifully different that I can't relate to it, but they have so much to give, and I think all teachers need to learn that.
Yeah, that sounds really great.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Austin. I loved it, and I love the conversations.
Yes.
I mean, we've had this one on the camera, but really, I love what we've been talking about. What you're experiencing right now is really near and dear to my heart. Me personally and as an educator. So I'm so glad that I've got someone who's like-minded on my team. So
and I feel like we can put both of our experiences together, the formal and then the informal, and kind of make this really good mashup this year with these kids.
I appreciate it.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.